Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Sometimes it can seem daunting when you look around and you see the culture crumbling all around you. But more often than not, there are positive signs of life. And today, we have an opportunity to share with you one of those lights in the darkness. So much of what Hollywood produces contains agendas that don't typically align with our values of faith, family, and freedom. In fact, we're often inundated with messages that at this point are just exhausting. And many have turned away from Hollywood and companies like Disney and have found a home with Great American Pure Flix. Well, our guest today is Greg Allan Martin, and he's the star of the new hit series Shadrach. Greg's journey to the big screen included college football. It included a stint with Harvard Law School and 3 decades in the LA County DA's office prosecuting criminals. We're going to talk to him a little bit about that. But he discovered that the courtroom and the stage both require moving storytelling. This new series, Shadrach, is one that promotes good old-fashioned values like hope, family, and faith, and is a much-needed alternative as we fight to restore the culture. Greg, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jimmy. It is a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you got to be pretty excited now. You know, we're going to talk quite a bit about the launch of this new series because it's a pretty big deal. And I've seen a lot of clips of it. I have not seen the actual episodes yet, but I've seen enough clips now to get a real sense for just the value of that. I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but you certainly took an interesting route to the world of entertainment. Take us back all the way to your playing days, your football days at Vanderbilt. What lessons did you learn playing football that have led to success beyond the playing field?
Well, I always think that kids, to the extent that they're able to do so, playing sports is just such a terrific thing. You were probably an athlete yourself growing up. My dad was a big athlete. I had 2 brothers. We were very competitive with each other. And Dad made it clear to us right from the start that, you know, you learn about teamwork, you learn about adversity, you learn about setbacks, you learn about defeat, and you learn how to win gracefully, hopefully. And I certainly experienced all of those things. But the other great thing about my dad and my mom, I don't want to leave her out of this conversation. My dad was the athlete, but my mom and my dad both emphasized that old sobriquet student athlete, and that the student always came first with that. So that's what led me to choosing Vanderbilt. I wasn't the greatest football player in the world, but I was blessed enough to get a football scholarship there. But I wanted to go to a school that I knew was going to emphasize academics over athletics, because I knew that myself, as well as most young athletes, the chances of going pro are very, very slim. So I knew I wanted to have an academic background that would give me a chance to do something else in my life.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I know that you had academic All-American honors there at Vanderbilt. I know you did really well there. So, you know, football is a very competitive sport, right? And it's probably the most competitive sports, some would argue. I was just down with a group in Texas, and Texas football is you know,
exactly.
is one of the craziest environments I've ever been around. We were down there building teamwork and unity and kind of developing their culture. And I remember that what's great about it, though, for the student athlete is the competitive nature of it, right? It helps you overcome your fears. It helps you tackle obstacles, and you want to win. And I think, you know, that probably served you well as you went on to Harvard Law School, I'm guessing, which I do want to ask you about Harvard today versus what you may have experienced years ago. But tell us a little bit about how you went to Harvard Law School.
Well, it's funny going back to what you mentioned about Texas football. Yeah, I grew up in Arkansas, and football was big there, but not like Texas. I mean, it's a religion down there, of course. And
it is.
But to go back to what you were asking about going to Harvard Law School, I knew when I was at Vandy that I wanted to go on and continue my education, and the field of law had always attracted me. I have an older brother 2 years ahead of me. He also played football at Vanderbilt, and we were very competitive, and I tended to follow in his footsteps a lot. But at some point I thought, I'm going to do something different. He went on to Stanford Business School, and I thought, I want to go to law school, not just to do something different from him, but the whole idea of law and the idea of criminal law was
Mm,
something that really spoke to me because it seemed to deal more. And this was a very naive thing. I didn't really know anybody
mm,
involved, and I didn't have any family members in law, that sort of thing.
mm,
But I just had this idea that law, and especially criminal law, dealt with matters of truth and justice and fairness and
mm.
morality, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
that's what led me to go to Harvard Law School. And
Wow.
I sometimes joke that I think I was their token Arkansan that they let in that year. Maybe I was a
I think
diversity
you're
hire.
probably right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I think today you might have a harder road getting into Harvard. So they've been in the press quite a bit. Recently over the last several months with some protests on campus and kind of some statements they've made. Obviously there's a culture war going on. We've got a greatly divided nation in many ways. In what ways is a place like Harvard Law School? How have they entered into the fray, and is it different than when you went there so many years ago?
Well, I have not been really involved to any great
Yeah,
extent with Harvard Law School since I went there, other than just attending reunions. But
yeah,
I read what you read and everybody else reads in the
yeah,
press that
yeah,
it's a completely different environment.
yeah,
It's just gotten so much more divisive, and I mean everybody knows this, so I don't need to go
yeah,
into detail there. That's
yeah,
not the way it was when I went to school. Of
yeah,
course, you had a variety of differing opinions,
yeah,
and I was a Christian going in there. I
mm,
didn't hide that, but I didn't also wear it on my sleeve either.
yeah,
But what's interesting is my faith. I know this is not exactly what you're
mm,
asking about, but it,
mm,
it is related.
yeah,
My faith, I grew up in the quote unquote Christian home, went
hmm,
to church every Sunday school. I mean,
yeah.
every Sunday, went to Sunday school, Young Life, that sort of thing,
Oh,
Fellowship
nice.
of Christian Athletes at
Yeah,
Vanderbilt.
yeah,
And when I got to Harvard, I was thinking that I was going to be around all of these incredibly smart people, which that
mm,
part was true, but people that would also just, belittle me for my faith or look down on it, that sort of thing. And
wow,
that was not true, at least within the group of friends that I had. I
mm,
had, 15 to 20 really close friends that I spent time with. We're still very close today, most of whom did not share my beliefs, my
mm,
spiritual outlook. And yet, well, going back to what I said about growing up,
yeah,
I had kind of a naive faith, I think, just because it's what I grew up with.
yeah,
And I think my faith actually became stronger at
mm,
Harvard Law School. And here's
mm,
why: because these people had respect for me. They
yeah,
didn't belittle me, they didn't make fun of my faith, they weren't intolerant of it. It was more like, hey, why do you believe that? I'm
yeah,
curious. I've never met anybody, any smart person who actually believes this stuff. So what that did was it caused me to go back and take a look at my faith and go, okay, do I really believe this just because I grew up with it?
yes,
Just because it was
yes,
cultural? Or is
yes,
this really true? And the
mm,
great thing about being in a place like Harvard Law School or any law school, any pursuit like that, truth is important.
yeah,
So I went back and started, reading a lot of Josh
mm,
McDowell and other apologetic stuff. And what happened was it obviously, as it can't help do if you take those works seriously, it just strengthened my faith. So it wasn't just that I believe this because it happened to be where I grew up or the family. I
mm,
believed it because I was convinced it was true.
mm, that's
So I actually
fantastic.
became a stronger Christian coming out of Harvard.
That's
It's probably
amazing.
a lot harder to do these days.
Well, maybe, but I love what you've said. It's kind of like when your faith is tested, when your faith is challenged a bit, it does make you discover what you believe and why you believe it, that you're actually putting your faith in something that is true. And I think,
Absolutely.
a lot of times you're going to have to defend that faith in an environment like Harvard. I was with a gentleman today who just moved back to the US from China, and he said that the climate there versus the climate here with respect to religious, tolerance, we'll say, is very interesting. Now, China, of course, is a closed country. They're very
Yep.
opposed to faith. The church in China is, generally speaking, underground. But he said it's interesting. He came back here. He said the Chinese are curious about his faith,
Hmm.
whereas here people are so guarded and skeptical, and actually, in some ways, more hostile towards his faith in Christ. And I was just stunned. I mean, you're talking about you would think the roles would be reversed, that people would be
Right.
hostile to it in China and more open and curious here.
Isn't that interesting?
Amazing.
Wow.
Well, I love that you exercised your faith, and I think you grew in your faith at Harvard. I'm sure that's part of your journey as well. Have you always had a love for justice? I mean, when I look at your bio and I see that you served for almost 3 decades in the LA County DA's office. Now, when most people think of the LA County DA's office, what do we think of?
These days, George Gascon and or OJ,
OJ, there you go. Exactly. So,
right?
is that the environment that you were in? Tell us about that. You had a love for justice. Did obviously you spent a long and distinguished career in that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I missed the OJ
Yeah.
debacle, let's
Yeah.
say. It was not a proud moment for the DA's office.
Right.
I had not joined the DA's office. I was a few years after that.
Yeah.
So I missed all of that. But going back to the idea of justice, I mean, this is aging me, of course, or dating me, but I grew up when Superman comics and the original Superman TV show were on. So the
Yes.
idea of truth, justice, and the American way always
Yes.
sort of spoke to me. But
Yes.
more pertinent to the faith aspect of that, my favorite verse, and it was a verse that I had in my office on my desk, it's Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your Lord? And I felt it was important to incorporate all three of those things into my work as a prosecutor. Now, to back up a little bit, when I joined the office, the DA at that time was Gil Garcetti. And I remember we had an incoming class of maybe 15 people, 15 new DAs, and he met with us all. And one of the things he said I will never forget, he said, from this moment on, you have both the privilege and the responsibility of doing what is right.
Wow.
And that really stuck with me. And I carried that through because I really do feel like what I was doing as a DA was doing what was right. But that walks, I mean, that is applicable to all three of those aspects. To do justice, of course, that's my job, to make sure that justice is done. People are held accountable for the crimes that they commit. But mercy should always come into play when it's warranted. I mean, there are people. I mean, I'd look across at the defendants on the other side and just try to figure out what's going on with this person. Doesn't mean that I would let them walk away from what they were held accountable for, but I need to have a spirit of mercy that makes it to where I'm not just trying to punish somebody just because I've got the power to do so.
Yeah.
And the final part of that is walking humbly with the Lord, knowing that even though you've got that power as a prosecutor, you're not God.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it's great to know. I always think in this, we call it a culture war because we feel like there is a fight for our traditional values, for our religious freedoms, for the founding principles of America. We feel like we're in a bit of a fight right now to preserve the culture. But I think that's all the more reason why we need men and women of God in these key positions, whether it's a DA's office in LA or it's as a local politician in your community, or it's teachers in the schools. We really
Absolutely.
need people of faith because we're accountable to a higher standard, to a higher calling. And really, no matter what we're doing, it really is our calling. It's our assignment. And our job is to bring God's kingdom into that environment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember back when I was playing football. Again, I was a member of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, and we had something that's not unique to them or to any profession, really. But I wasn't the first person to say it. But it was always, we have to remember that we're not football players who happen to be Christians. We're Christians who happen to be football players, and that's true for any profession. That your Christian faith, living out your Christian faith wherever God has planted you. That's the most important.
It's amazing how big of an impact that had. My life was marked by the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in college. I went to Virginia Tech. I'm a Hokie. That East Coast. Let's go.
Yes,
Thankfully,
absolutely.
we weren't rivals with Vanderbilt, so that's okay. We can keep being friends. But FCA was the ministry that God used in my life to really deepen my faith. And then many years later, I came on staff with FCA. I was on staff serving for 17 years with FCA.
I did not know that. Wow.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, I was really glad to hear you mentioning them and Young Life, two great organizations. There's so many great ministries to young people today. Um, listen,
A
you.
large portion of my tithing goes to the Fellowship of Christian Athlete.
Oh, that's
I know
fantastic.
2 or 3 guys who've been in there for many, many years. Yeah, great
Oh,
folks.
it's so good. So good to hear. Hey, so what piqued your interest in acting? I know that your acting career actually overlapped a bit with your role as a prosecutor. Um, what drove that interest, and how did you make that transition?
Yeah, it's good you picked that up. You've done your research. There was some overlap because I do get the question sometimes. So, what led you to go from law to acting? And I go, that's not exactly the way it happened. I'd always had this
Right.
love of it. Growing up in the Methodist
Mm,
church, my mom was very involved in doing church plays. I used to go watch her. Never thought that I would do it someday, but sure enough, when I got into junior high, I started doing these little church plays. I didn't have time to do theater when I was in high school, especially in college, because between being a football player and a student, there just wasn't enough time. But I'd
mm.
always had this passion for it, always this interest.
Oh,
And uh, oddly enough, when I got to Harvard Law School, I'm so intimidated by how smart all these people are. So I gravitated, as well as doing my studies, I gravitated towards intramural sports and to this little theater company, this little drama society we had. And we did plays, a couple of plays every year. And usually they were parodies of big movies that had been released within the last year or two.
nice.
And going back kind of full circle to what I had said earlier, the movie that had been released the year or two before I went to law school was Superman. So we
Crazy.
did this whole parody about how Clark Court, we called him, comes to Cambridge, Massachusetts, enrolls in law school. So I got to play Superman in Clark Court. So that was a lot of fun. So I continued to do it there. And then when I got in the DA's office, once
Mm,
again, didn't have time for a while, but I started going to Hollywood Presbyterian Church, legendary
oh,
historic church in the heart of Hollywood. At that time, Lloyd Ogilvy was the pastor there, just this
wow.
wonderful, wonderful man of God. And
Mm,
I'll never forget, side note here, going into that church for the very first time, didn't know anybody. I just moved to town, heard about the church, didn't know who Lloyd Ogilvy was. Went sitting way
wow.
up in the balcony. That's back when churches like that used to be packed to the gills, sitting way
Yeah.
up in the balcony.
Yeah.
And they do all the choir singing and introductory stuff, that sort of thing. And then this gentleman comes out and he starts speaking, and I went, "Okay, that's it. I know I'm in Hollywood because they've hired the voice of God as the pastor. And if you've heard Lloyd Ogilvy speak, you know what I'm talking about."
That's
But I
fantastic.
shortly found out that there was a fledgling, and just within the last year, theater
Mm,
company there, Christian theater company, professional Christian theater company at Hollywood Presbyterian Church called the Actors Co-op, and they are still there. COVID hit them pretty hard, like most
wow.
small theater companies. But we had 2 theaters there, and we did 4 or 5 plays a year. Really, really top-notch, excellent work with really good actors. And
Amazing.
while I was in the DA's office, I did about 25 plays with them during that time I
Wow.
was in the DA's
Wow.
office. And people used to say, you're a trial attorney during the day. Why would you want to go do theater at night? And I would say, well, it's because an audience of only 12 people at a time is just not enough for my ego.
That's right. That's so good. Well, you got to be Clark Kent, during the day, you're Clark Kent, during the night, you're Superman. I mean, I like this.
Exactly. That's another good analogy.
That's fantastic. I love it. I'm guessing that there are some parallels. I know that this may not be an exact parallel, but there have to be some parallels between, the storytelling, so to speak, making a case for a jury and being able to be a storyteller on the stage. I'm guessing that those probably are similar in many ways.
Jimmy, you are on the nose with every one of these questions. That's exactly right. So much so that after I'd been in the DA's office for a while, I went to someone in our training department. We have a training department that trains new DAs and then gives ongoing training for DAs
Mm,
for on various topics, of course, as the time goes on.
mm,
And I said, I would love to teach a class to new DAs
yeah.
about exactly what you're talking about. I said, because I've been an actor, I know what the benefit is, and I've done enough trials by then to see how important it is to be able to tell a good story, how
Yeah.
important it is to be able to connect very specifically with jury members. It's like connecting with
Mm.
an audience, which I almost said. So
Right.
I taught that class, and I had a lot of fun doing that. So
Amazing.
yeah, sometimes I think a lot of trial attorneys are frustrated actors. So
Yeah.
I was not a frustrated actor. I got to be one at the same time. But yeah,
That's right.
it's the same kind of thing. You've got to be able to convince people that you're telling the truth.
Yeah. And now you get to play one on TV. I mean, this is pretty good. Not this specific role is not an attorney, but nonetheless, you've had a number of interesting roles. I'm fascinated by this. I got to watch some of your clips, and I'm like, man, this is so crazy because I know so many of the shows. But most notably, you were in the hit series Ozark. Tell us a little bit about that role.
That was so much fun, as you can imagine. Now, to preface this, when I got that audition, I saw it was with Jason Bateman, and the scene was with Jason Bateman, who is such an amazing, talented actor and director. But
Yeah.
at that time, this was the first season, second episode of the first season. So they are
Gosh.
months, if not a year away from this thing ever coming to screen. So I had no idea what this was going to turn out to be. I just thought, Jason Bateman, it's got to be a good show. Sometimes shows work, sometimes. So the fact that it went on to be this unbelievably good show, very dark, but
Yeah.
still such a good show. I had no idea. But I
Yeah.
got a chance to work with him that one scene that we did. We spent pretty much all day working and on that scene, and he was a terrific guy to work with. It's always a pleasure when you come in contact with somebody who you've known about for so many years, and they are at such a high level, and they turn out to be just a really decent guy. Kind of reminds me, going back to sports, what my dad always said, and it's helped me not to be intimidated by working with people like that.
Yeah.
My dad would always say, when we look at these athletes, pro athletes, and talk about them, gosh, can we be like that someday? And he just goes, son, it's an old adage. It wasn't original to him, but he said, they put on their pants one leg at a time, just like you do.
That's right. That's right. Well, it was interesting to see that scene. First of all, epic scene. And I think you carried this scene, to be honest. He was great, but you really carried that one scene with the boat and the storage. Oh my gosh. I was cracking up because I felt like you were commanding that interchange, it was really fun to watch. Well, let's pivot a little bit because now you've got big things on the horizon, right? Was your move to Pure Flix and family-friendly series intentional? Was this a move that you said, boy, this really aligns with my values, with my faith? Was that intentional?
In a way, I would say yes, it's intentional. Only insofar as that's been my heart to do more family-based and faith-based programming. But as an actor, you're out there trying to get work wherever you can, and it's
Right.
very difficult to do. Now, I wasn't able to pursue this full time, of course, because I was an attorney,
Right.
full time job as a DA. So I was able to do some theater at night, and then every once in a while get to do an audition. And so I was really blessed to be able to do some shows like Ozark and Mad Men and some other things along the way. But I could only work for a day or two or a week maybe, and then I'd have to go back to my real job.
Right.
Very, very blessed to have a real job. Don't get
Mm.
me wrong. I know a lot of
Yeah.
actors who it's a big struggle just to make
Yeah.
ends meet while they're trying to pursue their passion. So
Mm.
I was never desperate. I just enjoyed working when I could. But the chance to go on and do something like Shadrach, what happened was I had retired a couple of years ago. And that's a long story that's not necessary to go into, but it was just time to retire. And it had been my prayer to God, I want to do some more faith-based things. I want to do some things that really speak to my heart. Because what I always loved doing on stage, even though we were a Christian theater company, we didn't do churchy plays. We did very good, sometimes very classic plays. I got to play Atticus Finch at To Kill a Mockingbird. Oh my gosh, that was the dream of a lifetime.
Wow.
But I wanted to do something that really spoke to my heart, and I felt like could influence people. And this is also happening at a time where the industry has been more receptive to those kind of things. I mean, there was a time, and you remember this, long, long time ago, when Chariots of Fire was sort of the standard for a faith-based type film, and you'd always hear people go, "Why can't we do that again?" Well, within
Mm,
the last, 10 years ago, there's been so many great projects. Mel Gibson doing The
yes.
Passion of the Christ. And now
Mm,
you've got all these companies. You got, the Chosen that's happening,
yeah.
the one from Jesus Revolution, Unsung Heroes, Ordinary Angels, Soul Surfer,
Yes.
all these movies that
Yeah.
really are not only have a grounding in faith, but they're quality. There
Yeah.
was a time you'd hear faith based and you kind of go, ugh, but they're really
Yeah.
quality. So the combination of now
Mm,
you have the ability to do really quality entertainment
mhm.
and do something that's faith based. That
Yeah.
spoke to me. So that was my prayer. And sure enough, sometimes God answers prayers. Sometimes
Yeah.
he doesn't in the way you want him. But in this
Right.
case, 3 months after I retired, I got the audition for Shadrach.
Amazing.
And when I got that part, we had to go to a shoot in Covington, Georgia, outside Atlanta for 6 weeks. If I had gotten that audition a few months before,
Mhm.
4 months before, 5 months before, I would have had to say, I can't do this. I can't
Yep.
leave to do this. But I got to
Wow.
go spend 6 weeks on this set and do something that I think is really a lovely piece of
Yeah.
TV entertainment.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about it, because I've seen a number of trailers, a number of clips, and it is fascinating. I can't wait to watch it. Tell us
Yeah.
about the new series. What's it about? And tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, this is a Sony Affirm Films or Affirm Originals production. Affirm Originals is the faith based
Mm.
subdivision of Sony, and they're one of the leaders in faith based entertainment. And this, I believe, is the fourth original series that Pure Flix has aired this year.
Wow.
So it's a big deal for them. And
Yeah.
the storyline is, and you learn this within the first few minutes, their parents with their two kids, a 12-year-old girl, 10-year-old boy, Anna and Michael. The dad loses his job, basically kind of loses his company. So they're living in the big city.
Wow.
And all of a sudden they have to go, we can't afford this anymore. So they have to move to the country and
Wow.
live with Paw and Graham on their farm. So the series is all about how you can so quickly get
Mm.
thrust into so much change. And
Yeah.
change is hard. And it's about
Yeah.
three generations all of a sudden having to live under the same roof. And you can imagine this 12-year-old girl who's living
Mm.
in the big city and got all her friends and her social media and everything, all of a sudden being yanked out of there to live in the country. And in fact, in the first episode,
Wow.
she gets there, she gets out of the car and goes, holds up her phone, goes, there's no cell service here. So it's a huge change for the kids. And the
Amazing.
dad's lost his job. The mom, who used to live in this small town, is now having to go back, feeling
Wow.
like she's got her tail between her legs now. And the grandparents, they've been settled and living this comfortable life on the farm. And now they've got four people living in their house. So it's all about new beginnings and how God throws things in your path and how you not only learn to accept that, you learn to embrace it and
Mm.
thrive in that kind of situation and learn from each other.
It's amazing. I think in terms of how much we need that message right now, this message of resilience, of grit, of overcoming challenges, of really relying on your faith, because I
Yeah.
know faith is a big component of this movie, right? There's How does this movie handle faith? Obviously, there's some prayer in the movie. How does it handle that?
Yeah, it's a series. It's a 6-part series,
Yep.
so it's not a standalone movie.
Right.
But it's a really good question because this is not, again, going back to what some people's notion of faith based is when they hear that. They
Yeah.
think, all right, it's going to be preachy, it's going to be cheesy, it's going to be
Mm.
saccharine. This is not that way. It doesn't beat you over the head with that. This
Mm.
just happens to be who they are as a family.
Yeah.
They go to church. They say grace before meals. Sometimes when things happen in the midst of, let's pray about that. But again, they're not hitting
Yeah.
you over the head with, there's a pastor in there in the local church that they meet. He becomes a friend of the family and he's this jolly, fun loving guy. And there's drama in it. There's some humor in
Mm.
it. There's a lot of charm in it, but it's not something that's preaching to you. It's just
Mm.
showing a family that this is the foundation of who they are and how
Yeah.
that bedrock of faith helps them to learn how to be with people in an uncomfortable sometimes and in
Yeah.
a situation they're unaccustomed to and learn
Yeah.
to learn from each other. I love the fact that you've got three generations living together and all of a sudden young girl and the boy are learning so much from the grandparents, and the parents are
Oh
getting
my
to spend
gosh.
time with their parents who they haven't been around for a long time, and the grandparents. And I love this as my character, Papa. He's getting to invest as a mentor into these young kids that he
Mm.
probably before this only got to see maybe on holidays, maybe on rare occasions. So it's that faith is a beautiful part of
Yeah.
what they do and how they are as a family.
Well, this must have come pretty naturally to you, given your background, given the way you were raised, given how important your faith has been. I'm sure that this was just an easy transition into living out your faith on the screen in a real practical, kind of gritty way. And I think that's what I love about this series is it makes faith and it makes family and it makes this generational connections. It makes those things good and wholesome again, and it kind of shows people what's possible. I think it's part of our culture that we're really missing now is this generational connection in families. Why is programming like this so important as we all endeavor to kind of restore our culture and our values?
Yeah. I don't know if I can say it any better than what you just said,
Mm.
but yeah, it's vital because not only is our world so divided now,
Yeah.
and that can be within families as well, as we all know, but it's so much more common than it used to be back in the time when I was growing up, and certainly in the generations before that,
Yeah.
that families tended to stay in the same
Yeah.
relative location, if
Yes.
not just right down the street. In fact, where we shot this
Mm.
was on a farm in Covington, Georgia, as I said. And the people who live there, this wonderful, lovely Christian couple, and they've got this big farm there, and the mother lives over here, and the in-laws live over here, and they got a brother who lives here. So they were actually living out what we were acting while we were
Amazing.
there.
Amazing.
But as parents, when you're kids, I've got two boys who are in their 20s now.
Mhm.
They moved away from home,
Yeah.
so I don't see them that often.
Yep.
And I'm not a grandfather yet, so I didn't have that to draw upon. But someday, I just hope and pray that they'll live close enough to where I get to
Yeah.
spend this kind of time with them.
Yeah.
And I think these days you forget what those connections can really mean, and more so with close family members than
Yeah.
anyone else.
Yeah.
And to have that generational difference, because you get older,
Yeah.
you got more wrinkles, but hopefully you've got some more wisdom that you can
Yeah.
impart to the younger kids. And the older people are rejuvenated by being around these kids who are so
Yes.
much fun.
Yes. Yeah, I do think that that's one of the things that's been a casualty in how mobile and transient our society is. I know my wife and I, we hope that one of these days that our kids, who are grown adults, that they would be in the same community just because those relationships are so important. And then passing on values to the grandkids eventually is such an important part
Yeah,
of the way families are meant to function.
yeah, yeah. And I can add one other thing to that. One other
Yep.
thing that I did bring to this character that meant a lot to me. The last few months in the DA's office,
Mm.
I was the DA in the only juvenile mental health court in the county.
Wow.
They had asked me to come staff that and be the DA in there. And that was probably the most rewarding time I'd ever spent in the DA's office.
Mm.
But what I saw in it, the most common denominator with the young kids who would come in there, they all had some mental problems.
Yeah.
But more than anything, the delinquency that they were involved in had something to do with the mental issues, but
Mm.
it had to do with the complete breakdown of the family.
Yeah.
I could probably count on one hand kids who came into that courtroom who actually had an intact family.
Yeah.
And it just really impressed upon me how
Yeah.
unbelievably vital it was. And the ones that had a better chance was interesting, goes back to what Shadrach represents too,
Mm.
were the ones where not only it was very rare for a mom and dad to show up because
Mm.
a lot of times the dad was just absent. But when a mom showed up and a grandmother or a grandmother and a grandfather,
Yes.
those were the ones that I knew had the most hope.
Mm.
And that's what Shadrach speaks to as well,
Wow.
just how important those connections are.
Well, I'm so thankful for this particular series. I'm thankful for your role in it and the very unique perspective of faith that you bring to it. And I hope that you keep doing series like this because I think this is what it's going to take to build families back up again, to promote these great traditional values. What's next on the horizon for you?
Nothing definite yet, at least nothing that I can talk about. But there have been some auditions lately and some things that are in the work, and thankfully some of them are in the faith-based arena.
Well,
So I'm just open to wherever God leads.
that's fantastic. Well, hey, thanks so much, Greg. I'm telling you, I'm so grateful for our time. And we're going to point everybody to the series. This is
Great.
worth watching. It's going to be uplifting. It's going to restore your faith in the family unit and in generational change. Super thankful for you today. God bless you, my friend.
God bless you, and thank you very much.